Hello, my name is Inma Muñoa and I've been CLILing in the Basque Country for a long time now. Today I'm going to talk to my colleague Phil Ball about assessment in CLIL. So Phil, you've been working in CLIL for a long time now, and I suppose that you have heard that many teachers say that normal assessment and CLIL-based assessment are not the same thing. Do you agree with that idea?
Yes, I think it's an important thing to emphasise. Obviously, CLIL has to conform to the normal framework of assessment to a large extent, but there are considerations that you have to take into account that they're quite different. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, but what is the main difference? I mean, what would you tell to any teacher who is just beginning a journey in CLIL about the aspects that they should consider when assessing a student?
Well, let's talk about summative assessment first now, because that's the kind of assessment that teachers are always most preoccupied with, and it's the kind of assessment that all teachers have to do, no? And so you have to do it in CLIL as well. And I think the main point about summative assessment in CLIL is that you have to be careful of what's called the language demand, or what's called the language risk of the test itself. So, for example, if you design the test in a normal way, as if it were for an L1 speaker, then it might be a problem, because if the student fails, has the student failed because the language level of the student was insufficient, or was it because the design of the test was defective? A student uses lots and lots of academic language in the foreign vehicle language, then they'll get very high marks. A student uses some CALP, then they'll get reasonable marks. But no CALP at all, okay, they'll probably fail. If they can't express themselves and the exam is well designed, then just as in the L1, they've failed it. So what I'm saying is that the teacher has to think carefully about the design of the exam. The design of the exam mustn't have questions that are too open, like write everything you know about Karl Marx. It's going to be very tricky to assess conceptually, procedurally, and linguistically, and very difficult for the student. It's far too open. There's no structure in it. But if you ask students to do matching activities, or to write shorter sentences, or you suggest to them what they can put in an essay, even in the question in the exam, then you're not making it easier for them, but you're testing their knowledge in a good way, and you're seeing that they can use the language appropriately.
Very often you mention this concept, or this idea of the 3 dimensions of CLIL. Do you think that's also important when thinking about assessment?
Definitely, yes. I think that the 3 dimensions, we can use them to think about CLIL practice in general, but I also think they're useful for assessment. I mean, imagine if a teacher or student says that exam was really difficult. How would you judge whether it was difficult or not? Well, if you imagine the 3 dimensions, if you imagine the conceptual content, if the conceptual content is difficult, if the procedural content is difficult, and the linguistic content is difficult, it probably is, because if the concepts are difficult, the language tends to be difficult. So if all 3 are high, then you'd say that's a difficult question, and if you're aware of that, then you can adjust one of the dimensions. This is what we said about in normal teaching. You can adjust the dimension in the classroom. So you would adjust the dimension, say procedurally in the exam, and you would say write about everything you know about Karl Marx, taking into account Marx's early period, Marx's middle period, and the beginning of Marx's late period, whatever. But at least that gives the student some hooks, some cues to use. Or you could adjust the linguistic demand, and you just make it true or false. Adjusting the conceptual demand is quite difficult. It's possible, but the 3 dimensions, yes, I think that it's a very useful framework for assessment in CLIL.
What about formative assessment? Do you think CLIL is a more natural habitat for that type of formative practices, or that type of assessment?
Yeah, I think it is a more natural environment or habitat, to use your phrase, for formative assessment. I think that we've been moving from a product orientation of education to a more process type of education. And I think CLIL is further along the continuum towards formative assessment. I mean, if you think about the past, then when I was at school, you would have a long period from September to December, and then a summative test. But in that period, September to December, there was no kind of formative practice. The teacher wasn't asking you how you were getting on, how you were doing. There was no kind of advice. There was no sense of self-assessment or anything, or where you were, you just did the test. And now I think that because the teacher clearly is working in a second language or a third language, then they recognise that this period before a summative test needs to be developed. It needs to be filled in. No? It needs to be worked on, and so formative practice almost occurs by default. The best type of formative assessment surely is the dialogic situation between an individual student and the teacher. And the teacher says, "Well, Inma, how do you think you did in that performance yesterday when you were talking to your peers? What do you think you did?" And you tell me that you thought it was okay, but you could improve, and we talk about this. Teachers don't get much time to do this kind of thing, and some students perhaps don't like it, but that's the ideal kind of situation. You can have self-assessment, of course, where the student reflects on their own performance against criteria. You can have peer assessment when the students talk to their colleagues, their peers, no? About how they're doing, about how they've done a particular performance again. You can have portfolio assessment if you do that. That makes the student reflect on their own learning much more than simply leaving that period until that summative assessment. So yeah, I think that the process-based orientation of CLIL favours formative practice. Yes, definitely.
Do you mean then that doing CLIL can bring very deep changes into the way teachers assess students?
I think it is doing. I think that's already been happening. Yeah, I mean, you were saying the other day, actually, when we were talking, you were talking about how ICT teachers have also discovered that they can't kind of employ the blah 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 method. You can't explain to students what to do in ICT in computers. They have to actually do it. No? I mean, it's the subject sine qua non of doing, isn't it? Students have to do it, and so teachers have realised that they've had to kind of relinquish some control. They've had to, in a sense, by default, make the lessons more student-centred. And I think that's what's happening in CLIL for different reasons. I think in CLIL it's because teachers have understood that there is a possibility that the students will not understand them quite so well as native language students will understand them. I mean, that's a bad assumption as well, but anyway, that's what they do now. And therefore, they start to change their practice. They start to give more protagonism to the students and less themselves. And that results, of course, in a different kind of methodology. I think that's what's happened in CLIL. In some ways, it's happened by accident, but now we're beginning to realise that, and we're beginning to, if you like, formalise that into formal parameters of practice.
Mm-hmm. So you are basically saying that any teacher coming into CLIL should really review his or her assessment practices quite carefully, because there are significant differences.
Yeah, I think what we've said shows that clearly. No, I think there are fundamental differences, and even an experienced teacher who understands the basic ideas of assessment will still have to rethink a little bit their practice, particularly, as we've said, the design of summative tests, and also the frequency perhaps with which they employ formative types of practice. Yeah, I think they would have to think about it very carefully, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for this chat on CLIL and assessment. It's been really useful.
Thanks very much for asking me.